Hello and welcome back. This is again a video on value-added tax. We have spoken until now, or no better, we have spoken last time about what happens if a good is sold before it's officially imported, so that it's under the supervision of the customs authorities. And so that the legislator can say we renounce on any taxation on intermediate transactions before the official importation happens, because a later taxation is secure by the importation VAT. Now, here we are. Now we have to think about similar situations. That is something which has not strictly to do with imports, but it's a similar situation, and so we are going to speak about this in this context here. It's now about tax-free deliveries made to a tax-free warehouse. And to understand this, you must see that there are other situations where one could have the wish to renounce on bureaucracy, reduce bureaucracy, by renouncing on completely superfluous tax procedures. For example, that you do not tax an intermediate sale because later a correct taxation is automatically secured, so that you don't need that game. I take the tax, the next one gets it refunded by input tax, and so on and so on. Now, for example, these situations might happen in cases where you trade goods in the stock exchange. It might happen that these goods get sold and resold 100 times before they reach consumption. And that would mean for you and for the fiscal authorities that 100 transactions should be taxed, the money refunded to the next buyer, then that buyer pays own output tax, it's again refunded to the next one, and so on. An indefinite chain of taking money and giving it back. A mass of bureaucracy and everything unnecessary if the taxation of the last step, giving the thing over to the consumer, if that is secured. So one can think about, isn't it possible to create artificially similar situations like under the importation VAT postponement scheme, to say, well, we create a situation where it's absolutely impossible that the good can enter into free circulation and reach the consumer. And as long as that is secured, that it cannot reach the final consumer, we can then, with a good conscience, renounce on all the unnecessary tax procedures. So you could think about creating a situation artificially where a good is under supervision. That's the thing which must be in common with the importation VAT postponement scheme. And where it's absolutely secure that when that good escapes that supervision, it will be taxed. So how could you create such a situation artificially? Let's think about that. The idea would be to bring that good in question into a room somewhere in the inland where tax-free, untaxed goods are stored, and where there is a strict supervision of these goods so that they cannot be taken out of that room without being taxed. So strict supervision by the customs authorities or by the tax authorities would be the second condition. So nothing in that room. Everything in that room is completely untaxed, so that you know whenever somebody takes something out, tax must be levied. And it must be absolutely secured that the goods cannot enter into free circulation in the market without that this is being noticed by the authorities. But if all these conditions are met, then you can allow that these goods, as long as they are kept in this room, can change the owner as often as they want, 1,000 times, without that VAT is levied. because, well, if these goods are not taken out, they can't be consumed. So the buyer can only be a kind of a trader. Even if a final customer buys, a final consumer buys, well, you can't consume these goods before you knock on the door of the warehouse and say, here's my proof of ownership, please let me take my goods out. And then taxation must be triggered. Uh, so that's the idea. So we can artificially create a room where we can say, as long as the good is in that room, we can sell it and resell it and resell it completely tax-free without that any harm can be done, because the buyer either would get input tax refund, so that the taxation makes no sense. It's just to minimize the risk that something could be consumed, but there is no risk here. Or the buyer is a consumer, but then the buyer can't consume without knocking on the door, taking the goods out and being asked for the tax. So, as the principle behind that tax regime is the same as what we talked about just before in the last video, the importation postponement VAT scheme. It makes sense to explain and discuss this particular tax exemption here too. Let's call it the tax-free warehouse regime. And here is now how it works. You have a tangible good which is expected to be traded frequently. And now you think bureaucracy is a pestilence and you want to avoid and limit it. So you take care that this good is brought, delivered into a tax-free warehouse. Now this tangible good is somewhere under supervision in that warehouse and it stays there. Now if you sell it in the meantime, any buyer will only be a trader, and so that trader would get the VAT back, so you lose no money. Let's look to the first thing. Selling the good into the warehouse should already be tax-free, because when it's inside the warehouse, nothing can happen. So you can allow to sell a good which is brought into such a warehouse without tax. Then the next sale happens, and probably the price here is now 200. It's a net price. You can renounce on VAT because the buyer would get it refunded. It makes no sense to levy it. It goes on 300 again. This would just be a ping pong solution. Seller pays it, buyer gets it refunded, so you can also renounce on that. There is no risk of untaxed consume due to the supervision. Only when that good is then sold to somebody who takes it out from the warehouse, then you need to insist in taxing the price, and only the last price then. So VAT would now be charged on the large purchase price, as if no, not as if, it would be taxed on the taken on the last price. And so you would have, with 19% tax rate, a tax of 76. And when you compare that to the regular situation, you see that after this particular situation, you have exactly the same outcome, financially and for the consumer and for everybody, as if you had taxed all the different transactions within the chain under regular circumstances, because all the VAT amounts in the middle of the chain would have been refunded to the respective customers. So it makes no difference. The only advantage here is you renounce on bureaucracy. And imagine now you have indeed in that warehouse things which are traded in a stock exchange 1,000 times before they get consumed. Then you see how immense the bureaucratic advantage might be. You save, let's say, 1,000 tax declarations. So that's very convenient, and that is why you should know that. In German law, The tax-free warehouse regime can be found in paragraph 4, the list of the tax exemptions, and it has been inserted into number 4b. If a good is delivered into or while being inside a tax-free warehouse, this delivery is tax-free under number 4b. Now, a tax-free warehouse cannot be opened up by everybody. It can only be a tax-free warehouse if the authorities definitively have granted you such a status, and they only do it if there is a proven need for these simplifications. So there is additionally also a list of goods drawn up by the legislator in Germany for goods which can be traded free of tax within such a warehouse. There are only goods on a specific list for which such warehouse solution is allowed. That can be found in supplement number 1 or in German Anlage Nummer 1 to the German Umsatzsteuergesetz, the VAT Act. So there are many conditions, but the principle is very, very simple. And naturally, if something has been traded inside a warehouse, a tax-free warehouse, that is something which you can only get as information from case data if you have an exam case, or in real life you can only get that information if there is given proof by your transaction partner. Okay, so we must note, by the way, that in Germany there is an additional, let's say, condition which is meant to prevent abuse. You know, when there is a warehouse where you, for example, store coffee. Coffee is one of the goods indeed which you can use the tax-free warehouse solution for. Now imagine if there's coffee or other nice things in a warehouse, you know that these things sometimes vanish into nowhere in a warehouse. That happens. So you store 10 kilogram and when you come back, it's only 9.5. And then you see the people guarding the whole stuff, brewing a coffee, and there a question comes up. Is this my coffee? And that is something where goods stored in a warehouse could end up in consumption without that anybody pays for them. So they could be stolen and then would end up in consumption. And that is why German law says, well, we make a pragmatic approach. From the moment onwards in which a good stored in a warehouse is made up in a way that it could be ready for consumption, then the tax exemption is automatically ended and the last contract which has happened is retroactively made taxable. So that means if you have coffee beans in a big sack, let's say 50,000 kilogram, or I don't know in which quantities they are traded, probably now that was highly ridiculous what I said now, but if there's something which you can't really use for consumption, then everything is fine. But on the other hand, when you try to store these nice, let's take the Senseo coffee machine pads as an example, or other comparable brands, which you can just take and they are ready for consumption. You put them into a coffee machine, drink a coffee and be happy. That is already forbidden. So when these goods are in a state which makes them ready for human consumption by a final consumer, then there is no way to obtain the exemption any longer. Yeah. So if goods vanish from the warehouse, and are ready for consumption, then it's highly plausible that you would have untaxed consumption. And so the idea the goods may only be stored in a way, in a condition, or in a state where they cannot yet be consumed by anybody. That is a kind of additional safeguard against untaxed consumption. Additionally, whoever removes the goods from the warehouse is the taxpayer under VAT law. So it's either the seller who makes a sale and says, now my consumer wants to get the stuff, so we can't keep it inside the warehouse, we must send it to the consumer. In that case, the seller has to take them out of the warehouse and declare the contract, pay taxes on the whole affair. It might also be that the buyer, after, let's say, 4 months or so, gets the idea, okay, I'm not intending anymore to resell my coffee in the warehouse, I'm going to drink it, or to sell it in my own shop. So I'm knocking on the door of the warehouse, present my documents of ownership and say, please, I want now to take my coffee home. And then you would have to look into the contract. Okay, the purchase price of this buyer was 400. Now the contract gets retroactively taxable. And as the seller couldn't know about the end of the tax exemption, it's automatically now the buyer who has to pay the tax on the last contract. That rule can be found in 13a of the German VAT Act. It's a kind of a very logical rule. So whoever takes the goods from a tax-free warehouse is the taxpayer, and the net amount which was paid in the last contract when the good was sold, that is the tax base. However, that's not enough of safeguards. You need additional rules to prevent that goods can be taken out of a warehouse unnoticed. And that has been done in a clever way. Everything which is brought into such a warehouse has to be registered. And now if these things have left the warehouse, they must get registered to have been taken out. And the keeper of the warehouse must identify the person who is liable for taking them out, who is responsible for that, who is then the taxpayer. Now, if the keeper of the warehouse doesn't register the value-added tax identification number of that person, or doesn't register it correctly, then the fiscal administration cannot find out who took the good out and cannot make these persons liable. In that case, the rule is that the keeper of the warehouse who didn't provide the correct information is fully liable for all the tax which the fisc lost due to that negligence. So in that case, when you knock on the door of such a warehouse, take your goods out, and now somebody writing down your VAT identification number mixes up some figures in your ID number, so interchanges them so that you cannot be properly identified anymore. That means the 76, for example, which are due as tax now, have to be paid by the keeper of the warehouse. Naturally, if we don't have information how much the latest price has been, it would be clear that the fiscal administration would be free to estimate the price. That is an additional danger for the person responsible, because they will not estimate you too low. And this is a strong incentive for the keeper of the warehouse to make absolutely sure that nothing is ever taken out from the warehouse without proper identification of the person taking these things out and proper documents filled out and declared. Well, now you know already that nothing in the field of VAT, properly nothing, can happen without being in full compliance with EU rules. So that tax-free warehouse regime can only work if the EU allows it. There is a general provision in the EU directive which says member states can, for the simplification of administrative procedures, apply for a deviation from the rules. But this is not the case here because the warehouse solution is so attractive that it has been established as a general option for the member states in the EU directive itself. So you can expect similar rules in all the other member states. The details may vary, especially to how it is secured that no consumption happens without taxation. But the conditions under which such warehouse regimes can be set up can be found by you in the articles 154 to 163 of the EU directive. So if you are interested in getting some additional background information, have a look there and find out what can be possible there. Okay, that shall be enough for this small topic. And as you already expected probably now to hear, I can only say goodbye now. Thank you for watching the video. Would be nice if you like the video, if you recommend the channel to others whom you like, or to those whom you don't like, whatever you prefer, or to both categories of people to make things more difficult for them to find out why. And naturally, don't forget to come back to the channel next time. Thanks and goodbye.